Okay, so our next speaker is Elizaveta Levina from University of Michigan, and we'll talk about matrix completion and network analysis.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Always lovely to be at INI, one of my favorite places. So let me first acknowledge my collaborators in this work. This is joint work with Jiju, a long-term collaborator of mine at University of Michigan, and two PhD students we jointly advised. One, Steng-Shi Li, who just graduated and starts as assistant professor at University of Virginia in the fall, and the other one, Yun-Jung Wu, who graduated a year ago and is now in industry. So I know there are a lot of people in this room who know a lot about networks, but it's also a somewhat broad audience, so I will give a little bit of a general overview before I move on to that specific research topic. So let me just get this first thing out of the way. When I say network analysis, what I mean is relational data that is observed. So we have entities, you can think of them as observations in the usual classical multivariate sense. In the traditional multivariate data, we observe properties of individual entities like their age, gender, race, etc. Here we observe their relations, whether they are friends or whatever other relations we have. There is another whole area of work which is about inferring relations from the traditional features, say graphical models. I'm not talking about that at all. I assume that I know the relationship. And of course, you can observe both at the same time. You can have the traditional features and the relationship. There are lots and lots of examples of network data, and these are not just examples of where people have such data. It's examples of areas where people actually try to use network tools to answer their questions. So of course, social media is what comes to mind. First of all, Facebook, Twitter, etc. But it's not limited to that. It occurs in many areas of science. In ecology, people study predator-prey networks, gene and protein regulatory networks. In biology, brain imaging, and so on. And many, many areas where people try to analyze data like that. I'll just show you a couple of pictures, just a couple of examples. I kind of wish I had the time and the skill to do this, but it's not mine, it's my students. This is his own Facebook ego network, which, by the way, anyone can construct for themselves very easily with a Chrome extension called Lost Circles. So if you want one for yourself, you can do that. So what an ego network is all the friends of one person. And then you have to remove that person out of the picture, because otherwise you'll have a jumble of edges because he'll be connected to everyone. And so the colors are an output of some algorithm, but even in this one little picture of my students' friends, you see features that are common in networks, and we see over and over again. You see hubs, which are some central nodes that are very connected. You see spokes, things dangling on the edges, and you see communities, you see groups. So this is not a fluke. This happens over and over again in many places. Here is another network which was collected by Jie-Shin Jin and his student. I don't know if you can quite read the names here. Maybe I should zoom in. This is a citation network of statisticians. And many people in this room are there with big circles. Not every node is labeled, but the biggest ones are. The edges are mutual citations. And they actually weighted, so the counts are there. And this is not showing the whole network because it doesn't fit. It's a core, which is the nodes that are highly connected in the middle. And yeah, there are more edges here because it's the core, but you see some of the same structure. You see hubs, you see communities. And it could be a fun exercise to try and identify communities. But we won't do it just now. So quickly, notation. Hopefully I'm using all the same notation as Peter used yesterday, so there won't be too many clashes. I have n nodes, and then I have edges between them. They're represented by an adjacency matrix A, which in the simplest case is just binary, 1 if there is an edge and 0 otherwise. If it's undirected, so say two people are friends, like on Facebook, then the matrix is symmetric. If it is directed, say I sent you an email, but you didn't send me an email. That doesn't have to be symmetric. Another thing I just want to get out of the way is self-loops. Self-loop is an edge to itself. So you can see how in some contexts that's possible, like you could send yourself an email, but you can't be your own friend. It's a real pain to treat them separately, and so I'm just not going to worry about them. I'll just pretend that they're always possible. Their fraction is negligible, so we're just not separating them out. More generally, an edge can have a weight, or it can have a sign. You could be friends or enemies. That has different meanings. And if I have node covariates, I'll call them xi for node I, and there will be p of them. So standard notation for the most part. Not everybody analyzing networks does probabilistic modeling, but of course statisticians do. And so how do we model them? Well, the obvious thing to do, it's binary data, so let's say it's Bernoulli. More generally, you can model it as a Poisson, which is actually more convenient analytically, even if it is Bernoulli, but if it's a small expectation, then those are closed. The independent edges assumption is prevailing in the literature still. It's not always realistic. In some cases, it's completely unrealistic. But it's very hard to do anything without it. There are certain pockets of the literature that don't make it, but for the most part, we're still operating under this assumption. And you can think of it as an approximation, right? It's not true, but it might still give you useful results. Now, if you start thinking about it probabilistically, you realize that what you really want to know is the probabilities of edges, the matrix P, which is the expectation of A. Everything else is just noise. Right? So everything else that you know on top of that is just confusing you. Information is in P. And if you're going to be able to say anything, you have to make assumptions on P, because otherwise you just have a sample size 1. Right? If each edge is completely separate from every other edge, there's no information to share. So what kind of assumptions have people made? Communities, of course, as Peter talked about, is very common. But it's not just communities. You can more generally assume that P is low rank. There is an assumption of smooth graphons under which you can also do things. That's assuming that if you permute nodes in some suitable way, and you don't know this permutation ahead of time, then P will look smooth. And there are models that I might call edge formation, where you postulate some particular mechanism of an edge forming, which could be a function of latent features or observed features or both. And you parameterize it, so you have a small number of parameters, so again, you can estimate. So you need something to tie all these edges together or do inference. Questions of interest people have looked at are many. I'll mainly focus on the first two in this talk, which is community detection and link prediction, but there are other things you can do. You can ask how things will behave on networks, predict something that will happen. You can look at networks over time and how they evolve. It's a very interesting problem, which I will not touch upon, but there are many different questions. Now, the general principle that, at least to me, emerged out of all this enormous literature is there are many problems, many methods, but there is a fundamental reason that they work if they work. And there are two things that you need for your network analysis method to work. One is that the expectation has all the information of interest. Whatever you care about, whether it's communities or links or whatever, that's contained in the expectation, which means you have a good model, right? Your model reflects what you want to know. And the second piece that you need is concentration, and which is where the probabilists come in. And that just says A is not too far from its expectation. So then you can do inference. And a lot of the time, you're interested specifically in the eigenvectors. That's where the structure is that happens with communities. Then you need to be a little bit more specific. And typically, then people want concentration in the spectral norm, because then you apply the Davis-Gahan theorem, you get the eigenstructure, right? But that's really two things. You need the right model and you need concentration. Now, in concentration, there's been a lot of work done in probability. We have a review paper on this written for ICM, which we wrote 6 months ago, which I'm sure is out of date now, because people keep proving things all the time. But even based on that, there are some quite general results available on concentration which you can use. They're available now for the inhomogeneous Erdős-Rényi model. And that means each edge can have its own probability. So they're still independent. Independence assumption is crucial. But the probabilities can be different, and you don't say anything about how they're different, which includes most popular models that people have looked at, because independent edges is all you need. And I'm just telling you a very, very general thing, and there's, of course, a lot of more precise mathematical statements that you can make, but that's basically what happens. Dense networks can concentrate around their expectation without any further effort. And dense here means degree of at least log n, the average known degree. Sparse networks do not concentrate. If the degree is a lot smaller than that, then relative to the norm of the expectation, that difference will be much bigger. But the problem there is fixable. The problem comes from just a small fraction of nodes, and there are many options that people have developed for fixing that problem, and then you can make them concentrate as well. So there is a lot of machinery now that you can apply, and it'll just be able to say that this works. So what do people actually do to make inference? There are different methods for communities, different methods for link prediction and graphon estimation. And there are many of them. I don't even want to review them because that's a whole separate talk, but the point is there are many of them. For each task that you can think of, there will be at least 5 papers that can do it. So we start more and more coming to the task of model selection and choosing what actually fits the data. Now, the stochastic block model you have seen before, I know. I kind of look forward to the day when I don't have to mention it and I talk about networks. I'm not quite there yet. But here it is. You generate labels, throw some colors down from a multinomial distribution. You then generate edges, which only depend on the color of the nodes. You write it down this way. The parameters are pi, which is the probabilities of communities. You have this matrix B that collects the probabilities of edges. And you can write it this way in a matrix form, which is a nice way to think about it if you care about low rank stuff, because it's just, if you arrange memberships in a membership matrix, it's just a rank 2 decomposition. It's a block constant matrix. And last general picture I want to show you, just to, I know the block model has been studied nearly to death, and this talk is not about the block model, but it's still a hard problem, and I want to just remind you that it is a hard problem because fundamentally it's a combinatorial problem. And the reason is, to look at this picture, this is very nice, right? Very clean, communities are obvious. If you color it in the network, you see it, but this is when the nodes are in the right order. I don't know the order, so what I see instead looks like this. And the reason I'm showing you 2 pictures, not one, is because one of them is that one you saw before, just permuted at random. The other one is an Erdős-Rényi graph with the same density. Right? So, and I've had students claim that they can tell which one is which. You're welcome to study them, but I can't. And even with this high signal, 2 communities, everything balanced, everything is easy. It's a combinatorial problem. Not the easiest thing to do. Okay, so now let's move on to matrix completion and why this comes up. And I didn't just say all those things just for fun. It is relevant to what I want to talk about. There are many models to choose from. The SBM alone has many extensions. Even if you do the SBM, you have to pick K, the number of communities. Further, even once you pick your model, you have methods that need tuning parameters. For prediction, you need to evaluate. You need training data and test data. How do you do that? Well, cross-validation is the obvious way to go, right? We all know that you can cross-validate or you split the data at random. How do you split a network? It's actually not obvious, right? Do you split the nodes? Do you split the edges? What happens to the size? It's not clear. So this was our main motivation for the first piece I want to talk about. And there was this very nice paper by Chen and Lei, which was for block models only, so it's not as general as what I'm going to talk about, but it had the nice idea that if you split by selecting a group of nodes, and then you just look at the rows corresponding to those nodes, you can still recover the blocks, right? Think about it. It's a low rank matrix, right? You have enough rows. It's the same row space. You can still recover the basis, basically. And then the part that you didn't use, the little subnetwork, you can use for testing. So they did this for testing various types of block models. And we wanted to think of something perhaps a little bit more general that didn't so much depend on the blocks. So what we assume is we have independent edges, of course, and also that P is low rank. So that includes the block model, but it also includes many other things. And it is generally, people are in agreement that empirically that happens a lot in real networks we see. So this works whether the network is directed or undirected, has weights and doesn't have weights, doesn't really matter. As long as P is approximately low rank, you can do this. So what do we do? You can do it as either a sequence of random splits or cross-validation folds. Well, that's up to you. We don't split nodes, we split pairs. Right? So pair is not necessarily an edge. It could correspond to a 1 or a 0. So we're not looking at edges, we just look at pairs. We split them at random. That gives us a training and a training set and a test set. Then from the training pairs, we fill the matrix back in. We recover a full matrix. It's not exactly the same anymore because we fill it in, but it's the same size, which is important. Then we fit the model on this recovered matrix and then compute the loss function of interest, whatever it may be, on what was left out. Then, as usual in cross-validation, you do this over folds, over splits, average, and pick the model or the parameter to minimize your loss. Now, how do we fill it in? This is where matrix completion comes in. Unfortunately, a lot of work has been done. I'm just giving a small selection of references more from the statistical side, but this has been studied extensively in the compression literature and applied math more generally. In matrix completion, people normally just think of a matrix with missing entries. You know which entries are missing, so you have a mask. You know where you didn't observe entry. Your goal is to recover the matrix, and there are different flavors of matrix completion that you can do. Noiseless matrix completion requires the observed entries to be preserved, exactly the same, and you're just allowed to fill in the missing ones. That's a pretty hard constraint. Noisy matrix completion minimizes a loss function between the observed and filled in, but they're allowed to be different. You can also do one-bit matrix completion, which is when the entry is a binary. So that's specifically designed for zeros and ones. Computationally, that's unfortunately much harder, as you can imagine. But there are methods for that as well. So how do you solve the matrix completion problem once you formulate it? Again, you need assumptions or constraints on the structure of the matrix. Why? Because if there is no relationship between the missing entries and the observed entries, then the observed entries tell you nothing, right? So you have to assume some connection between them to fill them in. So almost universally in the matrix completion literature, they assume low rank. And the other very important assumption for all the matrix completion results is that the entries are missing completely at random. So the mask entries are IAD Bernoulli. And that's not always realistic, as you can imagine. But for us, that's actually fine because we take out the entries completely at random, right? It's not they're not missing by nature, but we just take them out. And then the bulk of the research in that topic focused on how to solve the optimization problem, right? The optimization problem subject to rank constraint. Rank constraint is hard, so there are various convex relaxations and various things people have done. There's a lot of tools, but they all need this low rank and missing at random assumption. And that's okay for us, because what we do is we take it out ourselves, it's completely at random, then we recover the full network, and as long as we can make our low rank assumption, we're good. We use noisy completion because if you think about it, we actually want the expectation, right? We don't need to preserve the exact binary entries of A because the information is in the expectation anyway. So there's no point making it noiseless, and it's also faster to do the noisy version. At a very high level, I'm not going to give you any details, but why does this work? Why does this work as a cross-validation method? It works for two reasons. What do you need for cross-validation to work? You need your training data and test data to be independent. This holds here by assumption of independent edges, independent entries of A. And the other reason, again, is concentration. So we need an assumption of A being not too sparse. Otherwise, you won't have concentration. But if it's not, then basically A hat concentrates around its expectation about as well as A itself. And so in some sense, you can think of it as generated from the same distribution. Has the same expectation and the same kind of order of variation. So at a high level, this is how this works. So concentration comes back in again. The exact choice of matrix completion method doesn't really matter. You can use your favorite. We use singular value thresholding just because it's faster instead of these convex relaxations. There are even faster algorithms with matrix factorization that you can use for really large networks. And it sort of depends on the size of the problem you're trying to solve. The computational cost of doing this will depend, of course, on both your matrix completion method that you pick and the model being fitted. The model may also be expensive because you still have to fit the model every time. So sometimes this may not even be the bottleneck. So I'll just show you a couple of quick examples from different parts of the network literature. This is a link prediction algorithm, or you can call it a graphon estimation algorithm. This is earlier work. You don't need to know anything about it other than it's an algorithm which has a neighborhood smoothing parameter, right? Graphons are something smooth, so there is a smoothing procedure that goes on. There is a tuning parameter. Here are a couple of pictures. This is just synthetic networks. The first one is truly low rank, right? So it only needs to be piecewise smooth, by the way, not overall smooth. So that satisfies it, right? It's piecewise constant. So that's strictly low rank. The second one is smooth, but it's full rank, so it's not low rank. So we also want to test, okay, we assume this low rank, what if it's not true? What happens? And then you have the A in the right order and A in the permuted order that you see. And so what happens with tuning, the first one is for the low rank model. The curve on top, the blue dots, are the errors you get for various values of the tuning parameter, the fixed values. So there's a nice curve, there's the best value. Our cross-validation, in that case, picks it every time because it is low rank, so the assumptions are satisfied. The second one, there's also the best value, but it doesn't satisfy the assumption, so we don't pick it every time, but it's doing something reasonable. It's not too far. So we can't guarantee it without the low rank assumption, but it looks like, at least empirically, it behaves sensibly. It doesn't completely break down. Here is another example on this statistician network, because that's always fun to look at. Let's say we want to extract communities by regularized spectral clustering. That's a very popular general method that doesn't actually assume a model. Again, all you need to know about it, if you've never seen it before, is that it has a tuning parameter. You also need to choose the number of communities. So here there are two things to choose. The number of communities, which is k, and this tuning parameter tau. The nice thing with you can choose all of them at once. It's cross-validation, so it doesn't matter. We cross-validate across both. It selects 19 communities, which is a pretty large number. It's not so easy. And my student actually, so it's not entirely dreamed up. He actually went and downloaded people's research interests from their web pages, which was a lot of work. And so this is semi-manually constructed, semi-manually labeled, but he did look at that. And so the communities that we get out of this are very interpretable. If you look at the people and their research interests, it kind of makes sense. So it did something sensible, and we didn't really have to worry much about any of the tuning questions or model selection questions. Now, beyond cross-validation, that's the end of part one, but I promised you matrix completion and network analysis, so there has to be more than one use of it. Beyond cross-validation. We were very lucky there because the edges were truly missing at random by our own construction, so we could just use it. What if we move into the real networks that are incompletely observed, like really incompletely observed? Then the edges are probably not missing at random, but can matrix completion still help? Can we still do something with matrix completion that will help us more generally? And we don't have a general answer for that, but in certain cases, certain mechanisms, you can still do some things. So here's one example of what you can do. This is for egocentrically sampled networks. So what is egocentrically sampled? And this is mainly in social networks that people do this. It's a survey. You go into a school, you select a sample of students, you give them a questionnaire, and you say something like, name your 5 closest friends, or you say, list the people you talked to today, or some other thing like that. And then that's what you have. For those students, you have all the edges they reported, but you didn't ask anybody else. So here is a toy example of what it might look like. It's a toy graph. You selected nodes 3 and 6. You asked them about their relationships. They reported certain nodes, and the rest is missing. Note there is node 1 here. 3 and 6 are not friends of 1, but I still assume I know it exists, because say it's in a school of students. There is another version where if nobody mentioned that person, you don't even know they exist, then they will not be in your network. That's harder, so I'm not doing that. So I do assume I have the full set of nodes, and I just selected a random sample from there. So for those, you assume you observe complete rows. So this is, you can write it this way without loss of generality, right? I'm just writing the sample rows first, and then the other rows, you'll observe their connections to the people you asked, but you will not observe the connections between the people who were not asked. And what we assume is that rows are sampled randomly without replacement from the full set, and also that P is low rank, again, because matrix completion is really hard to do without that. But then we can do something. And the specific thing that we do is motivated by this particular matrix algorithm. This has nothing to do with networks or statistics. It's purely a factorization algorithm motivated by compression. So what they wanted to do is, for compression purposes, instead of storing a whole big matrix, you want to select some number of rows, some number of columns, store only that, and then from those rows and columns, reconstruct A in this way with some small thing in between. And so you solve this problem for you, and you keep C and R. And so there is an algorithm for that. It's called the CUR decomposition. We tried that algorithm directly. It doesn't work very well for our problem, but it's an algorithm. So we did something else in that kind of framework. And the low rank idea is crucial because think about the row space, right? The space spanned by the rows of A. You really only need R of them, right? Because it's rank R. So if you sampled enough rows and you sampled it at random, then you should be able to recover that rank R approximation reasonably well. So that's the first approximation. The second approximation is by concentration. A should be reasonably close to its expectation. And then by the same token, that's reasonably close to P1, just the expectation of the top part, because you've got enough rows. And that you can estimate. And then we treat that estimated P1 hat as sampled rows from P, from the true expectation. And then we just recover it with this CR loss function. So we first do the low rank cleanup. We don't do it directly. We do the low rank, remove the noise, and then do the CR. This is, I'll skip these examples. We tested this on a number of data sets. It works well, better than other options. Let me skip that. You knew it was going to work well, so that's right. Here's another application, which I think is more challenging, and in a way what we do is less satisfactory, but I think it's a good first step. If you start thinking about why networks are incompletely observed, there it was surveys, so we were still taking a sample, right? We're still selecting people at random. But there may be other reasons why links are not there or not reported. Think about school friendships, right? You ask these kids, name your 5 best friends. The kids will have different loss functions, right? Some kids will tell you about their closest friends. Some kids will name the popular kids or the older kids, right? And that's individual. And so the people who are not named, that depends on their own features and on the features of the person who names them. And the surveys typically limit the total, and even if you don't limit the total, nobody's going to write a list of 25, right? They're going to write 3 and stop, because they can't stick. Here's another example. We actually have a data set like this as a hiring network, so that's directed. And that's saying institution I hired as faculty somebody who received their PhD from institution J. Why do you think that may not be completely observed? Or sort of biased in what you observe? You only observe the people who were hired, but not the people who you wanted to hire and made offers to, right? So, I mean, that's just different information. So, in both these cases and many others, the missing mechanism is very much dependent on the network itself, on the nodes and their characteristics. It's all mixed in together. So, as our first attempt to deal with this problem, we took a model-based approach. So, it's not as general, but I think it's a reasonable model. So we wanted to take a model that we know, guess what that is, model with communities, and incorporate an edge nomination mechanism. And I think this edge nomination mechanism can also be incorporated into other models, where this is just more proof of concept. So we distinguish between edges that are really there and edges that are nominated and actually reported. So we'll start with, because we wanted to analyze this hiring network, we'll use the directed version of SBM. It's just like the SBM, except the probability matrix doesn't have to be symmetric. So A is not symmetric. So what do? We let each node have its own individual preference from which communities it will nominate. So it could be like your close friends, or the grade above you, or whatever. So that's determined by how closely you link to them. So that's one parameter the node has. And then we also let each node have its own individual nominating intensity. So some people will just name a lot of friends, some people will not name as many. So we allow them to go with different numbers. So we introduced this new variable, let's call it Rij, which is just an indicator whether the entry Aij was reported by node I. That's directed. And we assume that it's Bernoulli with that probability. So there's nominating intensity, and it depends on the block model parameters, but how strongly it depends on the block model parameters is controlled by lambda. So what we then observe is the product of the true A, which we don't see, and this R matrix. And because we are making all these assumptions about independence and Bernoulli, we can just directly write this expectation of the observed entry. So we call this stochastic block model with nominations, and we did the usual things. We derived identifiability conditions. We have a fitting method, which basically uses something like a method of moments followed by spectral clustering. And we showed its consistency. I'm not really going to talk about this. We also have a conditional version, which I think is more sensible, which is saying, I'm only going to nominate my actual friends. So A first has to be generated, right? If a link wasn't created, then I'm not going to consider that for nomination. But turns out you treat them quite similarly. But I'll just end by showing you this example. This is the data collected by Closet and his co-authors. They first published a paper on this. This is not statistics, so we don't have to worry about this. This is business schools, only US business schools. And so this is the hiring network. And of course, here you do see self-loops. Self-loops are possible. They sometimes hire their own graduates. There are 87 nodes total. So the edge from I to J means that institution I has hired graduates from institution J, and it's weighted, but very crudely weighted. The weights are only 1 or 2. That's just how they recorded the data. It's 1 if they have exactly 1 graduate from that place, and 2 if more than 1. We used our cross-validation method to select the number of communities. That is so convenient. We can just not worry about what the model is. Still low rank. And this is what it came up with. So it chose 4 communities. And you may not know so much about US universities, and especially business schools. I don't know much about business schools. But for comparison, this is their average ranking by US News. That's a very influential ranking of graduate programs and professional programs. Pi ranking is something that Closet et al. Constructed in their paper. They had a method to rank based on that, so it's also just for comparison. So if you look at these communities, certainly the average rankings make sense, right? There is a certain hierarchy you see, and if you know a little bit about US universities, well, a lot of it makes sense, right? If we do this, I'm not showing the results here, but if we do this just by standard community detection, not going through all these things, but just running regularized spectral clustering, or fitting the stochastic block model or whatever, we don't get the same thing. We get some communities, but the rankings are a lot less separated. So it's not as clean. But apart from that, of course, we don't have ground truth here, right? We can just look at the rankings. But apart from that, we can get more information, because in this parametric model, there is a meaning to these parameters. So I can estimate, based on my fitted model, the average weight of connection between all pairs of groups. And so you can see that for group 1, that's the top group, the expectation is nearly 2. So they hire from each other all the time. But for group 1 to hire from group 4 is next to impossible, whereas group 4 still hires from group 1, as you might expect, right? So it makes sense, right? There is a hierarchy, and institutions in the lower ranked places are more flexible. They also hire more from the category immediately next to them, right? And not jumping far above or far below. So this is the kind of information that you can get out of this model. You can also get individual information, which is this parameter lambda I. You interpret it as, what is that? It's the preference to hire from your own community, right? So the higher it is, the more you prefer people like yourself. So you can see Yale is way up there. University of Michigan is more flexible. It just gives you more information. Right? So to summarize, 2 main messages out of the talk. Age cross-validation, which I personally quite like. I think it was overdue to figure out how to reliably do cross-validation in networks. It's a very computationally feasible, scalable, I should say, given the name of the workshop. It's a very scalable method. It does rely on the low rank assumption, but that's not unreasonable for networks. One direction we haven't really explored, but I really think it should be possible, is doing the same thing to bootstrap networks as well as cross-validate. Because if you think about it, what am I really doing? I'm taking a network and then I'm creating a copy of it, which is not the same, right? And I can do it many times and create many copies using the same sampling mechanism. I'll have a sample. And it's a non-parametric bootstrap, right? I'm not resampling from a parametric model. We actually tried it. It seems to empirically make sense. We just haven't proved anything about it actually being proper bootstrap. And I think that is much harder because then you will have to look at specific models and exactly where is it correct bootstrap, etc. But just as something to try, I think that that's a good option to have. And more generally, matrix completion, which is not a very statistical field, can be very useful, sometimes directly in our edge cross-validation, because by construction, we can just use their results and their methods. At other times, their assumptions do not quite apply, but if you put in some more work in adapting existing matrix completion or maybe developing some different matrix completion methods to network-specific scenarios, you can still get interesting results. So lots of promising future directions. And I managed to say the word future as well as scalability. So there we go. Thank you.
Questions?
I was wondering, I agree that a lot of these matrices that you're looking at exhibit low rank kinds of approximately low rank, but it seems with the structure of the networks too, there might be something more there beyond just low rank. For example, as Zervashi was mentioning, something like this union of subspaces or union of low rank structures, partially because of the community structure and so forth. Have you thought at all about looking at something like that?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think the reality is always more complicated. I think the closest we've come to that is actually the talk that Peter gave yesterday is a hierarchy, right? This is a hierarchy of low rank spaces, if you like, right? Of a particular form. How to do a general union of low rank spaces, I haven't thought about. I think that's harder, but that's a good point. And it's a union of low rank spaces. Well, I guess it's low rank. I mean, it's bounded by the sum, but there are complications that happen, right? Right.
Well, actually, of course, I like to talk. Actually, going back to your beginning, where the independence of variables was assumed, and you had this PIJs, right? Well, really, all that's different from having independent, non-identity distributed Bernoullis on the line is that you put them in a matrix structure now. And we know, let's say on a line, that in general bootstraps, if the piece can be anything, bootstraps don't work. On the other hand, there are all sorts of different bootstraps which have been constructed under different assumptions, and you think of it as a time series here. So this is sort of the generalization of a time series. So it might be interesting to look at it that way too.
Yeah, so think of it as conditional bootstrap of some sort, right? Where like time series. Yeah, we really haven't thought much about the bootstrap version because of what is the distribution of this thing. But yeah, that's an interesting thought. I haven't thought about the time series analogy, but yeah. Right. Right.
So in the applications where you don't have ground truth, like a lot of the examples you looked at, have you guys thought about looking at the notion of stability across many different methods and many different cross-validation runs and whatnot to see?
Yeah, we actually do that. Yeah, I mean, you can, and in fact you should, apply stability selection on top of whatever you do. And You just do it in the usual way. There's I didn't talk about this, but I think it's actually some of the simulation results also included stability selection, and we sort of compared them without stability selection and with stability selection. If it's low rank, then it's just clean and it's always the same. If it's approximately low rank, then stability selection actually improves it a little bit. Yeah, you can definitely do that.
Okay, if there's no other questions, there is a coffee break now until 11.